The S1II has been out for a couple of months now, and I've had it since day one. In a lot of ways it's the camera I've been waiting for from Lumix, but that doesn't mean it's perfect. This is going to be much more of a real world review as a wedding and commercial videographer, as opposed to a really in-depth look at every single spec and feature. That's not really what I'm about. And yes, I'm going to touch on a certain controversial topic to do with the S1II, which I think has been massively blown out of proportion. For reference, I am based in the UK, so I'll be referring to PAL formats, which are the 25, 50 and 100 frames per second options. I might occasionally mention 60 and 120, but for the most part it will be those PAL formats. Also, I won't be covering any of the photo features as I just don't use them for my work. Apparently they're quite good, but again, I haven't really used them, so I'm not going to cover them in this. For context, I've been a Lumix guy since about 2018 now. I got the GH5 to replace my Canon 550D, and the jump up in image quality was quite amazing. I really appreciated things like the image stabilisation, all the unlimited recording modes, the shutter angle, which I use all the time, and things like the histogram as well. Again, an amazing camera and one which I really did enjoy using. I ended up buying a GH4 and another GH5, and that was kind of my wedding and commercial kit for quite a few years. In 2022, I did get that full frame itch, so I decided to buy the Lumix S5. That was mainly for things like the low light performance, better dynamic range, and just that kind of full frame look, which was becoming more popular in weddings. The S5 is a great camera, and the image coming out of it is beautiful. However, it's always had some slightly annoying limitations, such as the 30-minute limit in 10-bit recording modes, although luckily 8-bit wasn't affected. The crop in 4K 50 always used to really annoy me, and the autofocus, as we all know, was just not that great. Lumix really stuck by their DFD system for a long time, and I'm glad that in 2023 they finally realised that it is not the way. So as soon as the S5IIX came out, I decided to buy one, and I sold all my GH5s, so I was fully in the L-mount system. The S5IIX has been my favourite camera to date. The removal of the 30-minute record limits, the 6K open gate, and the really great autofocus have made it an absolute workhorse for the last couple of years. I think I've shot over 80 weddings with it, and it's just never failed me. It's always produced an amazing image, and I can just always rely on it to do what I need it to do. It's a very versatile camera that can do quite small projects, or it can do massive projects. You can really rig it out and it can hold its own. However, there were a couple of things that were just starting to annoy me, one of which was the crop in 4K 50 and a complete lack of 4K 100 and 120 frames a second. But when they announced the S1II with the much faster sensor read speed and the 5.1K open gate up to 60 frames a second, that was me pretty much sold. So I put my pre-order in and I waited. So I'd say first impressions of the camera, it's pretty much like any other Lumix camera. There's a few differences like the dials, which have actually got locking modes now, which is quite nice. An extra record button on the front. I really like the tilty flippy screen. There's a lock switch, and there's a few other bits and bobs like that, but for the most part, if you've used Lumix before, the body's pretty much the same. You're going to be very familiar with this. The very first thing I wanted to try out was the 4K 100 mode. Now I use a lot of 100p when I'm doing weddings, especially for portraits and confetti, but when I was using the S5IIX, I was limited to Full HD, and the quality drop was noticeable. So I really wanted a camera that could do 4K 100 and it look as good as the rest of the footage. And sure enough, the 4K 100 looks so much better than the FHD 100 coming out of the S5IIX. So I'm really pleased with that. Now I know there is a 1.2 times crop, but I really don't mind that. I'd rather have that than have to go back to shooting Full HD 100 frames a second. So on screen now, you'll see a bunch of different shots I took in Little Morton Hall in Cheshire in different frame rate modes. I'll make sure I include each frame rate mode I used. The most exciting to me, again, was the 4K 100, but I also wanted to try out the CinemaScope 4K modes because they don't crop in on the sides, which is quite nice. And I also want to try out the S&Q modes because you can use it in 120p in APS-C or in CinemaScope 4K. I was also quite keen to try out the 4K 50 modes as well as the 5.1K 50p open gate mode, which I will say now is fast becoming my favorite mode on this entire camera. For a first test, I'm really pleased with the results. It's basically every frame rate and every kind of cropping option I've been looking for that was missing on the S5IIX. Okay, so autofocus. Being honest, I don't have a particularly strong opinion of this. I really liked the autofocus on the S5IIX, and I'd say the autofocus on the S1II is as good as, if not better than that camera. Now, I don't tend to use tracking as much as other people do, so I might not notice the benefits of the S1II as much as others might. I do use tracking sometimes, and the tracking does seem a bit more reliable than the S5II. It is kind of annoying that you lose tracking in 4K 100 and 120, but again, I'm so used to using single area focus anyway, it doesn't really matter that much to me. Something that's been noted in other reviews is if you're using an external HDMI monitor and you're shooting in either 5.1K open gate or 5.9K and you're above 30 frames a second, for some reason you lose tracking. And I don't quite know why this is. I feel like this might be a hardware limitation or some kind of firmware issue, which I hope they can address, but for now, that is something to be aware of. So if you're shooting 5.1K open gate and you're using autofocus lenses and you need tracking, you're gonna have to do without monitor. Weirdly though, if you shoot in the external RAW mode, you gain that tracking back. If you're shooting in things like 5.9K, 50p or 60p, you do get the tracking when you're shooting RAW. So I don't quite understand why that doesn't work on the internal codecs when you're using a monitor. It's a bit strange, but there we go, some weird quirks. I've really been enjoying the OpenGate 5.1K and 6K modes. I've just bought an anamorphic lens, so I'm just kind of getting into that game at the moment. I bought the Blazar 50mm and it looks fantastic on the S1II. I'm really enjoying the fact I can do full sensor readout in up to 60 frames a second in anamorphic, which is just fantastic. And then you really get all the character of the lens, you have to crop the sides or anything. It looks fantastic. I'm really pleased with it. And following on from the internal testing, very recently Blackmagic released the update to the video assist, so you can now shoot RAW externally from the S1II. And of course, the very first thing I wanted to test was the 6K OpenGate, because you can now do 6K OpenGate externally via RAW, which you couldn't do on the S5IIX. So we went out again to test the B-RAW format. This time we went to Dunster in Somerset, and of course I took the Blazar Remus and got some footage I'm really pleased with. Again, the image quality, even at 12:1 of the B-RAW, is absolutely stunning. I really love the format and it just looks great. It always plays back beautifully. It's a really nice codec to work with. And even though I'm actually using Premiere as opposed to DaVinci, you get basically full controls in Premiere, which is really nice. So white balance, you can shoot whatever white balance you want and just correct it, which is great. So whenever I shoot things like music videos or short films, B-RAW is probably going to be my format of choice. Those who did shoot B-RAW in the S5IIX will be right at home here. It works pretty much the same way, it's just as reliable. You can shoot in basically any white balance and correct it without weird color shifts. The main thing here is it just feels like a more fully fledged RAW option. So obviously in the OpenGate, you can also get 4.8K 4:3 modes, you can shoot 5.9K up to 60 frames a second, you can shoot 4K now up to 100 frames a second, albeit with an APS-C crop. So there's a lot more options than you got with the S5IIX. Okay, so actual real world use. I've used it for quite a few projects, a number of weddings, a documentary shoot, a YouTube shoot, and a festival shoot as well. I gave the S1II its first wedding outing just a few days after it had arrived. For the most part, I still used my S5IIX as my A cam, as I didn't really want to go straight in with a brand new camera that was semi-untested. I did use the S1II for the confetti shots and a couple shots, and the footage was fantastic. I'm really pleased with how it came out. Again, I was never not pleased with the S5IIX, but the S1II footage just looks, again, being able to shoot 4K 50 without a crop and actually be able to shoot in 4K 100, which I did mostly, it is really next level, especially for someone like me who uses a lot of those higher frame rate options. Since then, I've picked up the tilter cage for the camera and I've used it as my A cam on 6 or 7 weddings now, and it's been fantastic. I really can't fault it. So if you've used any of the previous Lumix S series cameras or the GH series, you'll be right at home using this. There's not a lot of difference to it. There's button layout is ever so slightly different, but again, you'll be able to just pick it up and go. There's a few extra features, but aside from that, it's pretty much the same thing. One thing I will say is there's so many recording options that it's just a nightmare to scroll through. So I actually have started adding a few of my go-to modes to my quick list and then just added it to up on the D-pad so I can easily access it. But yeah, aside from that, it just pretty much works like any other Lumix camera. So if you like Lumix, you're probably going to like this. Aside from weddings, I also shot a craft festival in Exeter. They wanted some footage to promote it for next year that they can put on their social media and website. So I shot the whole thing in 6K 25 open gate. And again, I was really pleased with the footage I got. It was really reliable and just captured everything that I needed. And the stabilization really just works super well. In my experience so far, I'd say this is a really capable camera for weddings and events. I know there has been some questions so far in the overheating department, which we'll come back to in a little bit, but in my experience, I just haven't had issues so far. It is also worth noting on all these real world shoots, I've been using internal batteries and dual recording to both the SD card, which is a SanDisk Extreme, and the CF Express card, which is a pro grade 512GB. And again, I haven't had any issues. Something I briefly touched on is the stabilization, and this is no exception. I always found the S1II stabilization to be fantastic. I think this is marginally better, but generally speaking across all the Lumix line, it is class leading and it is fantastic. And generally speaking, I'm really only ever using the IBIS. Now, this does include the cropless E-stabilization, which unfortunately does not work for Sigma lenses yet. I'm really hoping that they can make it work for Sigma lenses, otherwise I'm gonna have to buy the Lumix 2470, which would be kind of annoying.
A lot of the things that I do now came from the days that I spent with my grandparents, and also things like the music lessons that I had.
I was very much inspired by Ed Cross's S1II review, where he actually went and shot a mini documentary when he was testing the camera, so I decided to do something similar. So I've actually been wanting to get into documentary for a long time. I've got a job coming up that I'm pitching for, which is documentary style, so I actually needed something for portfolio work, so this is the perfect excuse to do that. My good friend Gordon graciously agreed to be our subject, and we set about filming at the beginning of July. This time round, the S1II was rigged up to a monitor with a V-mount battery, but we're still dual recording to both the SD card and the CF Express card. All the footage on the S1II was shot in 6K open gate with the Blazer-Arumas Anamorphic, which is kind of the reason I bought it. It wasn't just a kind of whim, I actually bought it specifically for the documentary. As expected, the S1II performed fantastically. It was around 25 to 30 degrees inside, and I never even got the heat warning sign. We did 2 or 3 interviews, and each interview lasted for well over 50 minutes without any problem at all. I used my S1II as my B cam. Now, I didn't have a second anamorphic lens, so we actually modded the Helios 442 to have oval bokeh and streak filter, and that worked pretty well. I'm actually going to do a more in-depth look at the documentary we shot in a future video, so be on the lookout for that. Next up, I've got to talk about battery life, and for the most part, I'd say the battery life isn't that far behind the S1II. As I mentioned, the original S5 did have like amazingly good battery, and I always found the battery life drop between the S5 and the S1II was noticeable, but never a big problem. I'd say the S1II is almost on par with the S5II, maybe about 10% less. So when I'm recording things like speeches at a wedding, I'll usually notice the S1II drops its first battery bar a few minutes before the S5II, but it's usually pretty close. So I've generally found it to last around about sort of an hour and a half, 2 hours, depending on what I'm shooting. I'm going through around about the same amount of batteries on the wedding days, so I'd say the battery life is pretty decent. Okay, let's talk about the overheating issue. Now, in the time that I've been planning this video and writing it and actually getting around to filming it, there's been all this online discourse about it overheating super easily on forums, Reddit, YouTube, Shorts, all that sort of thing. Tons of people saying it's super unreliable, it shuts off really easily. Well, I've got to say that in my experience, that just hasn't been the case. Real world usage, it's been as good as my S1II. I really can't complain in terms of reliability and any kind of overheating, because it just hasn't been my experience. Now, it's not to say this camera can't overheat, it absolutely can, but again, in real world usage for me, it just hasn't been a problem. For long form content, anything more than a couple of minutes, I'm always shooting in 25 and not in 50 or 100, and I think that has something to do with it. Also, generally speaking, I don't really shoot a lot in direct sunlight, which I think is one of the biggest contributing factors. And then, of course, obviously, things like the CF Express card do add extra heat. So even though in my actual real world work, I haven't had any overheating issues, I did want to see what it would take to get the warning and to see if it would shut off. So I did do a few very unscientific tests. Now, if you want a super in-depth video on overheating, then Josh Cameron did a great video on that, but this is my kind of half-assed attempt at it. I think the main culprit from what I've seen is the 5.1K open gate in 50 or 60 frames a second. So that's the first one I tested. Again, dual recording to the SD card and the CF Express card with an internal battery. I left it in the sun, which is around about 25 degrees or so, and it did take about 20 to 24 minutes before I got the heat warning sign, and I never gave it a chance to shut off because I had to go back to work, but to be honest, I thought that was actually pretty decent. Now, I think if it had been like 30 degrees, it would have lasted maybe half the time, but that was better than I was expecting. And considering the amount of power and heat generated in that mode, because it's quite an intense recording mode, I really wasn't too worried about that. I also did a few tests indoors. Again, dual recording, internal battery. In 4K 50, I shot for over an hour until the battery ran out. Now, I did get a heat warning sign after around about 55 minutes, but it never got any further than that. It's also worth noting that the indoor temperature was around about 27 or 28 degrees at this point. Lastly, once it was a little bit cooler, around about 23 degrees indoors, I ran the 5.1K 50 frames a second again, and I ran it for over an hour before the camera shut off and didn't even get a heat warning. So I think it is very much down to actual direct sunlight that really causes it to overheat. And in a real world scenario, I'm just not likely to leave this camera out in the sun. The only camera I'd probably trust to do that would be the S5II and S5IIX, which I'm filming on now. But typically speaking, if I'm going to be filming an outdoor ceremony, I've got this in hand, so just moving around adds a little bit of kind of air and wind, and it's not in just one place the whole time. And again, I'm shooting in 4K 25 and not 4K 50 for a full ceremony. On top of that, ceremonies typically don't last more than about 15 or 20 minutes outside in England. Most people don't really want to be sat outside for 40 minutes in the direct sunlight. People just burn after a while. I do think just the physical limitations of the camera do push it kind of to the edge of what's possible in terms of just thermals. And ideally, I think it would have been better if this camera was just a little bit bigger, just to accommodate some of the more power needed for these sort of higher end modes and the more intense sort of sensor that it's got compared to the S5II and obviously the CF Express cards. But I don't think it's this super unreliable camera that it's made out to be. Now, my experience with the S1R2 was a little bit different. I've used it a couple of times and it can overheat pretty easily. But again, this camera, using it like I would typically use it for weddings or events or commercial work, it just hasn't been a problem. So overall, my experience in terms of overheating or lack thereof have been pretty good, and I don't really have any complaints about it. That's not to say I'm not aware of it, and I will be a little bit cautious for certain scenarios, but for the most part, the way I typically shoot, I don't really have any concerns, and I'll be very happy to continue using this in a professional environment. So to me, the S1II really is the best video-centric hybrid camera that Lumix has ever made. It improves and builds upon the S5IIX's limitations to really become a very compelling camera. As a workhorse, it just ticks so many boxes for me. I do wish that some of the tracking modes weren't hindered by the HDMI or the 100 frames a second, but that's only small things and I can work with them. So how can Lumix really improve upon the S1II? Well, there is the rumoured S1H2, which I'm sure will come out at some point. I'd really like to see a different camera body, more of a cinema-centric one, maybe a little bigger, just one that is absolutely rock solid with thermals. As I mentioned, I haven't had any thermal issues myself, but I know that there are limitations. So seeing a more cinema-focused body with the S1H2 would make a lot of sense. I'd also love to see internal variable NDs as well. That would be really cool. I'd like them to stick with a 6K sensor. To be honest, I'd be very happy with the S1II sensor and just absolutely max it out. Also as well, just a slight improvement over the HDMI latency would be nice. I'd also love to see an open gate mode that goes up to 100 or 120 frames a second, but that might be a little bit unrealistic. As has been mentioned again in other reviews, it would be nice if there were some higher end cameras that Lumix could make as well, at the 5, 10, 15 or 20 gram mark that can compete with things like the FX6, the Sony Burano, the Canon C500, cameras like that where there is a bit more of an upgrade path. Now I know they do have the Arri Log C, which is great, but there's a bit of a jump to go from a £3,000 camera to a £100,000 camera. I'd like to see something kind of maybe a bit more in the middle. Anyway, I hope that was interesting and useful from more of a real world perspective. I don't want to go too much over the specs, more just my experience of using it. I am a big fan of Lumix, so I'd certainly like to try more of their stuff in the future, but equally I also love the Blackmagic stuff. Sony does exciting stuff, Nikon's exciting, Canon's exciting, it's all exciting. It's a great time to be into cameras. So hopefully I'll be able to do more reviews like this, whether it's lenses, cameras, anything like that. So yeah, if you enjoy that sort of stuff or the other stuff I do, obviously feel free to subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one. Goodbye.